Namaste. Welcome to another fireside conversation with Vichar Manthan. Here we bring in leading experts to earnestly explore ideas through a dharmic lens. Our conversation here is not designed to provide any conclusive answers to the questions raised. Rather, we aim to spark a conversation so that some fruitful dialogue may take place in the weeks coming after such a fireside. For today's fireside, we have a topic that I'm sure is dear to many of us, namely stories. In particular, we will be exploring how the ancient epics of the East have shaped societies in the past and how they continue to be relevant in the present. To help us shed some light on this topic, we have two excellent experts, coincidentally both teaching and researching at the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford. First, we have Professor Diwakar Acharya. Professor Acharya is originally from Nepal and is currently the Spalding Chair of Eastern Religion and Ethics at the Faculty of Oriental Studies and a Fellow at All Souls College. Professor Acharya took on this post in 2016, having worked previously at several institutions, including the Nepal Sanskrit University, the University of Hamburg, and most recently, Kyoto University in Japan. He has to his credit a number of research papers, one monograph, and 3 books. He's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Indian Philosophy, and his research covers a wide range of topics in Indian religious and philosophical traditions, Upanishadic studies, epigraphy, the early history of Nepal, and Sanskrit literature. We are also very pleased to have with us Dr. Sahba Shayani. Dr. Shayani is the senior lecturer in Persian at the University of Oxford's Faculty of Oriental Studies. He joined the faculty in 2015 and has been involved with Persian language pedagogy at various levels since 2005. Dr. Shayani received his PhD in classical Persian literature from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2020. And his research focuses on the role of women and female agency in classical Persian epic romance poetry. I'm sure our audience will join me in welcoming both of our esteemed speakers to today's fireside conversation. So as I mentioned earlier, we're here to explore the ways that the great epic literary traditions of the East have shaped their respective societies in the past and continue to do so in the present. On the one hand, we have the Itihas tradition of India, encapsulated most famously by the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. These are tales that will no doubt be familiar, at least in their broad plots, to most of our viewers, and contain a treasure trove of stories and characters that have moved Hindu civilization over the past several millennia. On the other hand, we have the epic tradition of Iran, which has the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings, as its most famous representative. Although it may be unfamiliar to many of us, this is an extraordinary text which has shaped culture and society wherever the Persian language and culture has traveled, from Iran to Central Asia through to Turkey and India. As we embark on this exploration, I would very much encourage you at home to continue the discussion in the YouTube chat and to send in any questions you have for our speakers. As a way of opening our conversation, it might be worth us briefly setting the scene and sketching out the texts and stories that lie at the heart of this conversation. So if we can start with Professor Acharya, it'd be great if you could give an overview of what we mean by epic literature in the Hindu context.
Namaste. You can hear me, I hope. In Indian context, let's say, and predominantly Hindu context, I would say epics are for the masses, by the masses, and of the masses. So the epics are, on the one hand, they are literature, they can be enjoyed. On the other hand, they are vehicles of moral teaching, philosophy, and cultural collective memory. In a comparative way, we can say that why I'm saying that it is for the masses and of the masses, by the masses. When we compare epic literature with the Vedic literature, epic literature is in plain language. Everybody has access. There is no barrier. There is no hierarchical limitation. And it is not antiquated. And also it is to some extent fluid. So when we compare the Vedic literature is in a way, for the sake of preservation, it is frozen. It represents the frozen past in a way. It also has a certain way, the continuity is there. But there is no supply, continuous supply. But in case of epic literature, we have mythemes, characters, discourses all the time flowing into the epic literature and enriching that. So that way, it's special. And that way, it is also the reservoir of literary composition. So the many, you probably know that many wonderful stories, poems, dramas in Sanskrit literature, they stem from the epic. Okay, probably this much is enough for the time being.
That's maybe if you could give maybe some examples of the kind of texts that we're talking about. So Ramayana Mahabharata is probably the most famous, but I guess even those, just an overview of what kind of stories, what kind of texts we're talking about.
Yeah, no, like the most famous stories are like the story of Ramayana, the Rama's story, and within that story we have number of stories within the stories. For example, in Ramayana, you have a story of Hanuman, you have story of Jatayu, the excellent bird of kings in a way. And also you have there is a story of Shugriva and Bali, the brothers. There is also the story and also rift between Ravana and Vibhishana and so on. The same way, I mean, the other epic actually is much more colorful, much more fluid, and much more incorporative. You know? Like in case of Mahabharata, as earlier I was saying, it is the vehicle of moral teaching. It is to teach in a understandable way in the language of the masses the message of virtue, the message of prosperity, the message of pleasure, as well as the message of emancipation, liberation. These four aims of human life, or being human, or being in existence. And within these stories, what I'm saying that it is a kind of reservoir where you have things flowing into it. Like you have stories of Panchatantra, you know the story book, but most of the stories of Panchatantra you find already in Mahabharata. So probably they are collected from folk realm. So that way they are coming into the epic, and then they are again now flowing back into these literary texts. The same way we have the story of Sakuntala, so and Dushyanta, the mother of Bharata, after whom the India, the subcontinent, is called Bharata, Bharatavarsha. So basically, like we understand, we think that Mahabharata is the saga of heroes. So there is this Mahabharata war, and then within this war, things are happening. But to exemplify certain things in the middle of the discourse, that is the main frame story. We have many stories, many different discourses, and everybody, you know that Bhagavad Gita, the songs of the Lord, the guide, you know, so the Krishna. So that is within the epic. So historians might say that that is independent text. It is incorporated in a certain way. But that way you have like Gita is the same way later Kalidasa composed this wonderful, excellent masterpiece of Abhigyana Shakuntalam. The seed of that story is there. In Mahabharata is there, which actually again comes from Satapatha Brahmana. The basic seed comes in very subtle form. You find it in the Brahmanical material. Then it comes to Mahabharata. You have a bit elaborated in understandable way with different layers of meaning, and then it goes to literature. So it's somehow it's a vehicle of continuity also, you know.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think we've got almost enough in that opening statement itself to last an hour and a half, month, and lots of things to chew over the next discussion. Excellent. So Dr. Shayani, if we can come to you, and maybe you can provide an overview of the Shahnameh, its author, and generally what epic literature is in the kind of classical Persian tradition.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Hinesh John. So the Shahnameh, as Hinesh mentioned, translates to the Book of Kings, Shah being kings and Nameh being book in classical Persian. It was composed in 1010. It was completed in 1010 CE by Abu al-Qasim Ferdowsi, who resided in what is now northeastern Iran in Khorasan and Tus. And the Shahnameh basically, it is, as the title gives away, the story of the kings, but it begins with creation and ends with the arrival of the Muslim armies to the Iranian Empire and the conquest of the Iranian Empire by the Muslim armies. So you can imagine how much it contains in it. But the storyline more or less follows the lives of different kings. And although the kings are sort of these pillars that hold the story up together, it's actually really the heroes and these characters of the epic that capture the imagination of the population and are mostly the stories that people know about to a great extent. The greatest hero of the Shahnameh, his name is Rostam, and he's sort of like the Herculean figure of Iranian epic and myth. In the Iranian context, I think Shahnameh is known sort of as the mother epic. There are other epics that follow, but the Shahnameh is in many ways the earliest form of epic that we have. Within the Shahnameh itself, and what I focus on in my own research, there are plenty of romances, for example, too. And we have other romances from the same period as the Shahnameh, for example, Visuramin. But as far as epic goes, the Shahnameh is the earliest that we have. And in part, this is because a lot of the literature of ancient Iran, of the Achaemenid Empire, and later on, perhaps the Sasanian, were destroyed probably, and we lost it. So it's interesting actually to hear the format that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana take, and how it's sounds quite different in many ways to the Shahnameh, at least. And I was just thinking to myself, perhaps we had something similar in the past that was lost because these two cultures are so intertwined and so close that it would make sense. But the Shahnameh, yeah, like I was saying, is much more about the kings, the kings are the pillars of the stories. And then the stories that there are, just like Diwakar was saying, there are many stories that take place within the Shahnameh itself and within the stories. And the stories do have morals, but I wouldn't say that the Shahnameh is like a didactic text necessarily. There is an overarching moral to the story, I think. And that is that, I mean, I don't know if I should give this away right now, but the greatest tragedy of the Shahnameh is filicide. And it comes about through lies, through lying and deception. So sort of, you could argue that there's this overarching idea of deception being just wrong in general and leading to destruction. But as it goes, it's sort of more like a history in many ways, and a tool that preserves sort of a sense of Persianate identity, or if you will. I should mention from here that it is obviously known as the Epic of Iran. Iran in this context, however, refers to Greater Iran. So that land has always been referred to as Iran by the people since the time of the Achaemenids, but it encompasses many modern day nations such as Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and many of the neighboring countries. So the Shahnameh is not just a text that belongs to modern day Iran. It belongs to the Persianate world, really, to the Iranic world, if you will.
And these kind of stories that you spoke about in the Shahnameh, did they originate with Ferdowsi, or did they have kind of a long history in Iranian culture that picked them up from?
They don't originate with Ferdowsi. The Shahnameh can basically be divided into two sections. From creation up until the invasion of Alexander the Great is more of a mythical section. And from the invasion of Alexander the Great to the conquest of Islam, it's more of a historical, pseudo-historical portion of the text. It is believed that the mythical portion of the text predominantly comes from folklore and sort of stories that were passed by word of mouth. And that the second half has some roots in history and historical texts. Of course, the Ferdowsi does embellish things, but even Ferdowsi himself mentions that he has written sources, such as Shahnameh Abu Mansuri, which was a Shahnameh that was written in prose, versus the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, which is written in poetry, so that he took inspiration from. But that Shahnameh is now lost to us, and all we have left of it is the introduction. So we really don't know how much of it Ferdowsi was inspired by. There are portions of his Shahnameh that are also inspired, for example, by another poet who wrote before him, Daqiqi, but it's just like a small portion of it. So to a great extent, it is embellished by Ferdowsi, but the stories aren't created necessarily by Ferdowsi. They're stories that have roots in folklore and in some sort of pseudo-history and history.
Right, brilliant. I think that will be something that we'll definitely explore, is kind of the relationship between the text and its culture. So I'm looking forward to exploring that further. If we could just maybe move the conversation a little bit forward now, so we kind of have our main texts and main stories. Professor Acharya, if we can come to you. So you spoke very interestingly about the purpose of the Mahabharata and this kind of vehicle for almost morals and also a vehicle for ideas. So maybe we can tease that out a little bit about what the function of these kind of texts are, and they're often called itihasa. So maybe you can also explain what this notion.
But dear, let me the contextually what I heard about Shahnameh. Dear, probably in the Sanskrit world we can compare. The similar text is Raja Tarangini, which we normally, in a certain way, it can be called history. It is a historical epic from Kashmir. Maybe there is some sort of influence also is there, mutual influence perhaps. And exactly the same way, it starts with the creation myth and then ends with certain historical period and so on. But Mahabharata is has a special value. So as earlier I said, it is attributed to a divine being like Vyasa, the Badarayana, who is regarded as incarnation of Vishnu and so on. And also, again, we can't that way pinpoint its history, its author. So it is in a way fluid, and then it is simply fluid, but continuous cultural memory and cultural teaching and cultural probably the inheritance. So that way it has some special value, but where it starts. So that way, if we go a little bit philologically, historically, we can pinpoint like the tradition of Itihasa and Purana. These days we put Itihasa and Purana together, but as a genre, they were side by side with Vedas. They were listed in these Vedic commentaries, Brahmanas, the Brahmanas, and also in Upanishads, like in the oldest Upanishad, one of the oldest Upanishad, in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So both Itihasa and Purana, they are listed there. And the distinction there probably was Itihasa. It is already a sentence. So thus was the situation, thus was the reality, thus was the truth, it means. And so they were recording certain historical events, and their awareness of history probably was much beyond chronological history, and we can say it is more episodic and event oriented. And what is the moral, rational one should learn or can learn from that episode, that they remember. And within the Mahabharata, which is the epic, we can say, here and there in this course of conversation, let's say there is Bhishma, who is the wise grandfather. So when he has to teach something in a certain context, let's say he has to teach the Pandavas and Kauravas, they are brothers, cousins, and then they say that if you fight, so if you don't have internal unity, the family is broken, then the whole nation can collapse, or the whole family, whole monarchy can collapse. So in that context, he says that, let me tell you here an itihasa. So an itihasa, which is something happened there, and then he lists that. Look, Haihayanam Udavarta. So there was a bad leader among the Haihayas, and because of his ego, there was an internal rift, and the whole Haihayas collapsed. And the same way Nipas, Nipanam Janamejaya. So there is another Janamejaya who was among the Nipas, and then the Nipas collapsed, or they had to escape and reach the present day Nepal. That area. So these kind of probably historical evidence events they remembered, but not in chronological order, but with the moral, with the lesson. So this kind of things we see within epic. We see that way different number of or hundreds of such episodes of itihasa. And then about Purana, Purana probably was the slightly different genre. For example, within Mahabharata, the certain section is called Matsya Purana. This is the story about maybe the deluge. Exactly, it is not the same story, but one day Manu, the primordial human being, our primordial grandfather, and so he was collecting water, and then a small fish arrives, and then it announces that there is a flood, deluge coming, and so on. So this story, so it has some certain mythical value, a certain lesson, certain meaning is there, and this whole episode is presented in the Mahabharata, which is available to us as Matsya Purana. So they had a distinction of Itihasa and Purana. They were already there in at least late Vedic period. We have that way textual evidence. Maybe it even goes back. So the genre of Itihasa and Purana was there since even before the available Itihasas and Puranas we have.
Wonderful. So would it be correct to say that the genre of Itihasa differs from our kind of modern notions of history by kind of looking forward? So by trying to transmit a moral, so something happened and it tries to transmit a moral forward rather than just kind of recording history as it was.
Yeah, exactly. So now, but we also have some sort of chronological account, like they wanted to see continuity even between two lineages. So there is, in a way, administrative history, some sort of, and then the chronological history, the political history. But their awareness of history was much more lesson-oriented, moral-oriented than just a record of the timeline or chronology. So that way, whenever, let's say in Mahabharata, the word itihasa is used, we are told this kind of episodes. So where some real thing happened, and then what is the lesson and what you can learn from that.
I wonder, Dr. Shayani, whether any of this strikes you as something similar that the Shahnameh is trying to do, because I wouldn't regard it as a straightforward history like you would think of history today. So the Shahnameh seems to be doing something different, if I'm not wrong. Maybe you could.
Yeah, I think as I'm learning more about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, it sounds in some ways like the goal of the two texts is perhaps quite different. Whereas the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are, if I'm not mistakenly understanding it, they're in a way holy texts, right? And they're texts that are presenting the sort of teachings and morals and stories that have morals in them. I think the purpose of the Shahnameh could be said, it is, and I guess it shares that with the texts, the aforementioned texts too, in a way. The purpose of the Shahnameh is sort of the preservation of the Iranic or Persianate or Iranian and the larger scheme of things culture at a time when there had been sort of a shift, right, in the society and in power. And Arabic, for example, was becoming would later become sort of as the official language and so forth. So it was this, and perhaps it could be seen in a way as an effort to preserve the past, the history, and through that perhaps preserve the culture. I mean, that is what the Shahnameh is seen as today. And of course, it's always important to think, what is our modern day perception of something and what is actually the perhaps intent of the author thousands of years ago. They could be quite different. But it is, I think it wouldn't be a stretch to say that it is, a part of the Shahnameh is preservation of the Iranian past, of the larger Iranian history and culture and customs and traditions and identity, really, identity.
Does Ferdowsi describe his text in any particular way in the Shahnameh, for example? Does he maybe suggest some way of trying to interpret it, or what he's trying to do when he's writing this text?
Does he suggest a way to interpret his text?
Or does he describe it using any specific adjective, maybe, or something to describe his own work?
I mean, so actually it's interesting. There is a quote that in a way is one of my favorites of the Shahnameh that's attributed to Ferdowsi, but it's actually not in the Shahnameh. And I think that in a way encapsulates how we see the Shahnameh often today. He says, Basi ranj bordam dar in salsi, ajam zinde kardam bedin parsi. So he's saying, I toiled and suffered for 30 years. Basi ranj bordam dar in salsi, ajam zinde kardam bedin parsi. And I brought back to life the ajam. Now, just to give you some background, it took Ferdowsi a little over 30 years to write the Shahnameh. And ajam is the name by which the Muslims, or the Arabic speakers, rather, I should say, would refer to the Persian speakers as. And it was in a way a derogatory term, but because it means someone who can't pronounce words properly, because the way the Iranians spoke was weird to them, the way they try to speak Arabic. But then, so in this line attributed to Ferdowsi, and in a way then opted by the Iranians, they take on this title and they say, yes, we are Ajam. So Ferdowsi says, I suffered for 30 years and I revived the Ajam through this Persian, Bedin Parsi, through this Persian of mine. So I think, I mean, even though that specific line isn't in the Shahnameh and it's attributed to him, that is sort of the attitude of Ferdowsi, is that he is preserving and keeping and bringing back to life this heritage in a way through his texts. Yes. Okay,
so would it be correct to say that rather than necessarily documenting what happened as it was, as we think history, he's in some sense trying to preserve, in the face of kind of the Arab conquests, trying to preserve what it means to be Iranian or Iranianness through his text?
I think so. Yeah, exactly. He's trying to preserve that ajamness, right? For lack of a better word, their own identity. Yeah.
Okay. And it seems, is this one of the reasons maybe why Ferdowsi's text seems to have been so popular after his death? I mean, there's this, I was just reading this tradition from Nizami Aruzi about his death and this kind of mythologizing of Ferdowsi's death just a century after he died. So does that indicate maybe that Ferdowsi's epic was actually quite popular and took up a life of its own?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it is also the fact that, in a way, to what Diwakar was saying earlier, it is the fact that these are stories by the people for the people also, correct? So I think that's to a great extent where Ferdowsi wins, and why he becomes so beloved is because these are stories that were passed on by word of mouth, and he eternalizes them basically through his writings. And even much more later on in sort of the 1800s, and even before that, there was this, and even today, there's this culture of naqali, which is of recitation of these stories of the Shahnameh by memory by women and men. During the Qajar era and the early Pahlavi era, it would be in cafes specifically, and they sort of act out, the different scenes as they're saying the story. So I think that act in itself sort of shows that it's, this thing that's it's a grassroots sort of literary, not movement, but it has its roots in the people's traditions and cultures. So I think that is perhaps, yes, why He is so popular at the time of his death and even to this day. The other is definitely, like you were saying, the fact that he is, preserving this specific and individualistic identity that's different than from the incoming changes.
Okay. Wonderful. I just like to take a couple of seconds just to remind our audience to engage in the discussion on the YouTube chat and to send in. There's already lots of very interesting questions coming in, but the more the merrier, I guess. So keep sending them in throughout this conversation. So Professor Acharya, if we can maybe turn to you on the same kind of idea of how these stories were received. So you mentioned again, it's from the people, for the people. So maybe if you can just maybe lay out how the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and all these epics were received historically. So what's been their reception, so to speak?
But let me again relate with Shahnameh.
Feel free.
And repeat that if we really want to compare, so we can see that this Shahnameh kind of phenomena we can see in Rajatarangini, where and maybe it's being collected. The Kalhana who wrote it, he says that he's relying on some material available to him, and then even beyond Kalhana, it continues. There is further Rajatarangini written, and then there is local history, and also he wanted this to be received as Kavya and also recited and so on. So this kind of, in many ways, it seems, we can compare Rajatarangini with Shahnameh. So, but when it comes to Mahabharata, the epic, it is really different. I mean, even when we compare Ramayana and Mahabharata is unique and Mahabharata is much more the epic. So Ramayana is, in a way, the story of Rama, and then you have some even maybe some people may not like it, some sort of fantasy also involved, so this kind of things. But when we come to Mahabharata, the aim of Mahabharata itself was, if I go to the text itself, the Mahabharata text itself, how it conceived and how it wanted Mahabharata to be was like it says, not a single story on earth is seen not depending on Mahabharata, like the bearing of body not depending on food. So they wanted to have it really the storehouse of all kinds of stories, all kinds of teachings. So this mythology is the base of all compositions, like the mental activity of consideration is the base of all sensage. So like that. And then it also is seen as a poem. So it has literary value. It is illustrated, and it goes and further and says that, like a Brahmin, twice born, let's say, not only Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, civilized person, who knows all the Vedas, together with all Upanishads, ancillary texts. But if he doesn't know Mahabharata, if he doesn't know the epic, he can never be wise. So you can see. So this is the book of wisdom, and also it is book of memories. So probably by the time Bharata Katha or Jaya Katha, which was probably saga of the heroes, becomes Bharata and then becomes Mahabharata, by that time it is no more that way just the story of heroes. So the frame story becomes even somehow subordinated, and the main function of Mahabharata is much more to present these values.
So you mentioned in your opening statement some of these other texts like Kalidas, for example, that draw upon the Mahabharata, and that kind of shows the influence of the Mahabharata. Are there kind of other ways that the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or its stories have lived on? So maybe in folk traditions or these kind of things, like what has been the reception of these texts by later people?
Yeah, no, but like, as I said, initially probably these texts, even including Ramayana and Mahabharata, they are collecting and that way preserving these stories in a certain way. But when in different areas, actually, probably you know that there are many Ramayanas, so slightly different stories are there. You have Jaina Ramayana, also maybe you have Thai version of Ramayana. You have another version of story in Indonesia. So in different Indian world, in different parts, you have compositions based on these epics. So as Mahabharata wanted, so as it is in the preamble of Mahabharata itself is declared, all the poets, so it is a kind of hyperbole, but all the poets, they educate themselves from Mahabharata, they derive their stories from Mahabharata, and then they present it. Maybe they bottle it differently, but the wine comes from Mahabharata. Even the itihasho chayad asmad jayante kavi buddhaya panchabya iva bhutebhyo loka samvidayastraya. So from this storehouse, reservoir, or this stream of itihasa, every poet, so every poet mind stains. So like, and another analogy there is like everybody, every servant is waiting for the master, so that they are always oriented towards their master. The same way all poets are oriented towards the epic, and so on. So and also it says that, like, when you listen to the Mahabharata, the epic, it would be like after listening to the voice of cuckoo, you would never like to listen to the crows. So the Mahabharata is regarded as a sweet poem, teaching, and the source of all these stories, all teachings, and that is very much true. So like Kalidasa, so Kalidasa's story of Sakuntala, that you find in Mahabharata. The same way there is Pururava Urvashi's story is there. That is found in Mahabharata. Malavika Mitra, that is maybe a historical story. That is later Sunga period story. So that is not there. But otherwise, yeah, most of the poets like Kirata Arjuniya Bharavi, the story, this fight battle between Arjuna and Shiva in the form of a Kirata, that is there. And the same way, like, which is regarded as very academic poetry, Shishupalabhada of Maga, again, that story goes back to Mahabharata. So most of the stories, the same way, like Uttara Ramacharita, there are many dramas, many epics, that way, these literary epics, court poetries, they are based on the Mahabharata, like Raghuvamsha, Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha, goes back to Ramayana. And then you come to vernacular or other classical languages. So let's say Kampan's Ramayana in Tamil, or in other languages, Tulashidasa. So they all, one way or the other way, they go back to the epics.
Wonderful. That's almost a great snapshot of the influence of these two great epics on the subsequent literature and even beyond what you now regard as India. So I wonder, Dr. Shayani, maybe you could speak a little bit about how the Shahnameh has influenced kind of post-Shahnameh culture and literature, in general.
Sure. I think the Shahnameh's influence on later literature is on two genres in a way. It's on the epic, of course, and on the epic romantic, or just the romance, basically epic romances or romances. Most of his influence has been on those two genres. So as far as romances go, we can find the roots of some of our future romances, especially those written by Nizami, who's seen sort of as the greatest writer of romances in the Shahnameh. For example, on the story of Khosrow Shirin, the King Khosrow and his beloved Queen Shirin, or the story of Bahram Gur, King Bahram and his adventures. But as far as epic goes too, you can see the influence of the Shahnameh, but not from what I'm understanding, not to the extent of the Mahabharata, it sounds. For example, there are texts that stem out of the Shahnameh afterwards. For example, there's a Banu Goshasp-nameh that's about the daughter of Rostam. Well, no, there are stories that are then written, that are epics that are then written on the various characters, yes, on the heroes of the Shahnameh. But they never gain the same sort of influence that the Shahnameh itself does. But the Shahnameh is emulated from age to age. One of the texts that comes to mind right now is actually quite a modern one. In the 1800s, one of the most renowned Qajar kings, Fath Ali Shah, has a book written called the Shahanshah-nameh. And it's about his conquests, basically, but written in the format of the Shahnameh and the way of the Shahnameh. So you can definitely see the influence of it there, yes.
And kind of beyond texts, do we see any influence of the Shahnameh or even its stories kind of historically in the pre-modern period? So beyond text, so in culture, tradition, and custom, how has its characters or Ferdowsi or whatever lived on beyond
in the pre-modern period?
In the pre-modern period.
I mean, I think the character, for example, the character of Rostam is seen afterwards as the hero par excellence, you know, in all sorts of literature, Persian literature. He is, in a sense, the hero that everyone would turn to as the ultimate hero. Yeah, I think it's just the appearance of sort of, you know, in a way, I think it's more, and this is what my own research is on. I see this with the women of the Shahnameh, for example, and you could then argue that you see this with Rostam too, is that they open a kind of space that then creates room for further poetry to develop and further characters to develop. You see this with the women specifically, that what Ferdowsi does with the women of the Shahnameh and the agency that they have and the power that they wield opens a sort of space where then Nizami and future poets can come and create women who have even more power and strength. And perhaps you could say that Rostam does the same thing. He creates the sort of space in which then for the future heroes can manifest themselves and behave.
And then if we maybe look at the modern period, I think Iran, if we maybe make it a little bit more general, Iran seems to have a very specific reverence for its classical poets. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but even the tombs of Sa'di, Hafez, etc., are almost like pilgrimage sites.
Yes.
This magnificent tomb of Ferdowsi. So in the modern period, kind of, what is the influence of the classical literary tradition, the Shahnameh particularly? How is it seen amongst Iranians nowadays?
I think in the modern period, there's two sorts of spheres of influence, and even in the past too, of Persian poetry. One is that of the epic, like the Shahnameh, in which it helps create and maintain a sense of identity that is ancient, and that is in a way different from the neighboring, areas, perhaps one could say, and that is very much so tied in with the language itself too, but which encompasses a manifold number of people. I think that's one of the important things about the Shahnameh and the Iranian world at large, is that it actually encompasses many different ethnicities that make up Iran itself. Iran in the greater Iran, meaning not in modern day Iran. But so that's the epic side, but then you have the sort of mystical side of Persian poetry, with the great pillars such as Maulana, Rumi, and that, and Hafez too, and that creates more of a sort of that's the spiritual side of it, right? And that, in a way, perhaps that's where the spiritual reverence that people show to these poets comes from. Although I would argue that there is definitely a great sense of reverence shown towards Ferdowsi too. And even in the modern day, people go to the tomb of Cyrus the Great, for example, and sort of carry out one activities that one could see as sort of homage, like devotional homage to the king. But that's definitely tied with the whole identity thing. But as my late advisor, Professor Hussein Ziai, would often say, philosophy in the West, at least from the Western perspective, I should say, philosophy is to the Greeks as poetry is to the Persians, I think. And for Iranians, again, larger Iran, for the Persian speakers, poetry really is something that carries more than just a craft. It carries in it philosophy and religion and morality too, even if the Shahnameh is not a great example of it, maybe, but that's definitely the function of poetry.
I wonder whether maybe this is maybe me just speculating, whether both the fact that it's written in poetry, in this couplets almost, and the fact, as you mentioned, that poetry is this vehicle for philosophy and so much more, whether kind of its forms of poetry being quite easy to recite and to spread, and also the fact that it has a multitude of meanings maybe inside the poetry. Does that account for some of its popularity as well?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, even the meter lends itself to that too. It's a masnavi, so it's 50,000 couplets long, but the way the format goes is that it's, it's A, A, B, B, C, C. So every line has its own sort of rhyme in a way. So it's easier to remember, it's easier to recite. And as a result, it's easier for it to become popular and known. Yeah, definitely.
I wonder, Professor Acharya, whether some of that rings true for the Indic texts that we're talking about, the fact that they're in poetry, the fact that there's a multitude of meanings. And like you mentioned, the Mahabharata itself claims that virtually every scenario, every person you can come across is found in the Mahabharata itself. Does that account for some of its popularity and why so many people seem to draw from it?
Yeah, true. People can relate. So that's why I'm saying it's of the people. People can relate and identify themselves with the characters there, one way or the other way. And as Dr. Shayani is saying, probably Iran and India, they can meet on that point, that the poems or poetry is not just poetry. It's also it has a spiritual aspect, philosophical aspect, and the mystical aspect also.
I think if I could interject, as you were saying, Professor Acharya, that's actually one of the qualities of the Shahnameh too, is that the characters are all very relatable in many ways. Yeah. And even the evil characters have parts that are good, and you can very clearly, it's real, they're all real. Yeah. And the good characters do things that aren't so great. So you can connect with them, and they're not just tropes necessarily.
Yeah. No, but the same can be said about the mainly Mahabharata's characters, and even uneducated person probably they can that way, not formally educated, but they can understand. Like we talk about the Bhishma, so he is the man of his word. So he takes the oath, which is very difficult, remains unmarried for his whole life, and so on. The same way, like Dhritarashtra, he is blind, and then this is kind of lack of sight or somehow distorted sight. So that way, people even in modern period, continuously they have these characters there, and then we even do not need to tell the whole story. These characters remind you of the whole story, moral, the episode all together. That way it is there, alive. Yeah, can be related.
Wonderful. I'll just remind the audience, send the questions in. There's many questions that have come in, some quite interesting. Although probably the audience doesn't need reminding as much as I need reminding that the questions are coming in. So if we maybe move the conversation a little bit further, so we've talked about identity in our opening remarks and various points. So maybe if we go to the Shahnameh first. So recently I was, I think, reading an article by as a Nasifi, so a modern author, and in there there's, and I quote, it says, if people want to know what Iranian identity is, they have to read the Shahnameh. And this seems to be something that we've spoken about just before this. But I wonder, what would you say that this identity consists of? So what are the particular ideas, values, or worldview that the Shahnameh is regarded as transmitting as part of this Iranian identity?
That's difficult, I think, to answer. What are sort of the values? And I mean, definitely, I think one of the values, like I was saying initially, is the importance of truth. And for me, I find that very interesting because I don't remember if it was Herodotus or one of the Greeks. They say that the Iranians are known for three things: for archery and horsemanship or something, and the third one is telling the truth always, you know. So the Persians were known for this. So it's interesting because that is really what, in a way, one of the key essences of the Shahnameh, I think. And it shows because ultimately the filicide that I mentioned initially happens. Rostam, who's the hero of the tale, kills his own son Sohrab because he's an estranged son, so he doesn't really know him. And when his son asks him, "Are you the great Rostam who I'm searching for?" he lies and says no. And so then he defeats him. And then he finds out after he's killed him that that's his son that he actually killed. And this is the lowest point of the epic. So I think that is a general, sort of idea of the text that you could say continues. But to say that it's, sorry, Hinesh, can you repeat your question again?
Yeah, so what would you say that kind of this Iranian identity that we regard the Shahnameh as transmitting, what would you say that consists of almost?
I think
that Iranian-ness, so to speak.
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult question to answer because I think it is also, in a way, with the Shahnameh, it also becomes, in modern day, it becomes quite political too. Yeah. I think my perception, and really what I want to stress, is that the Shahnameh is a text that belongs to Afghanistan, belongs to Tajikistan, belongs to parts of Uzbekistan, belongs to, parts obviously Iran, but even the Gulf or Iraq, it belongs to all of these surrounding regions, because in the Shahnameh, and even beyond that, to all the Turkic lands, because the Shahnameh is a story that takes place, and I should have said this in the beginning too, is a story that takes place in Iran, Turan, and Rum, these three great empires that belong to one king who divides it between his three sons. And Rum is Byzantium, Turan is the lands north of Iran, the Turkic areas, and Iran is, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Iran, and parts of Iraq and so forth. So I think it's difficult. If you ask an Iranian nationalist, they'll say, oh, it preserves, Iran's separateness from the rest of the world and how it's great because it was able to remain independent regardless of, the Arab invasion and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's how history in the world works. I think we gain things from others just as much as they gain from us. So, yes, it definitely helps in creating a Persianate identity, but that definitely goes beyond the borders of modern day nations. It brings many more people together, I think, than it actually tears apart.
Okay, and would you say that Persianate identity is quite tied in, as you mentioned the idea of truth as being one kind of component of that Persianate identity maybe, but also is it kind of, to what extent is it tied into the language as well, the Persian language?
The concept of truth?
No, the Persianate identity, the Shahnameh.
The Persianate identity. Oh, it's definitely tied into the language. I mean, they're practically, one and the same in many ways. Yeah. That's why, these characters are characters that you go to Afghanistan, you go to Tajikistan, and they all know these people, then there's places in Afghanistan called Takht Rostam, and so it definitely brings in the language and the cultures and all of the stories, all of them, it ties them together. Yeah, I mean, that's why, in a way, I love that the quote unquote fake quote that's attributed to Ferdowsi, because it actually shows that it is through his, through the Shahnameh and through this quote unquote revival of Persian that he brings back to life this group of people, that perhaps could have had their culture lost, or their language and culture lost.
And to a certain extent, would you say that this culture is almost beyond confessional boundaries, almost? Like the Shahnameh doesn't, unlike other, I guess, similar pre-modern Persian Arabic texts, doesn't strike me as particularly Islamic. It kind of goes beyond those kind of boundaries. So
yeah, I think that's the beauty of the Shahnameh. I mean, the Shahnameh takes place in a pre-Islamic world, right? Potentially Zoroastrian. Yes, at some point it you have actually the arrival of Zoroaster and so forth, but it's a time period that's sort of, you can't really mark it as one religion necessarily. And actually, it's interesting because whenever Ferdowsi refers to God, and God is, well, when he refers to God, he often says Yazdan, right? Izad sometimes, but also Yazdan. And Yazdan is the plural of Yazd, actually. So you can translate it as the gods, or you can translate it as God, right? So that's an interesting part of it. And it is pre-Islamic, but now you have a Muslim society holding on to it so tightly and loving it so much and seeing their own identity manifested in it. So I think that's the beauty of the Shahnameh, actually, is that whether people want to admit it or not, it crosses boundaries of borders, national borders, but also of religion even, and in a way, it doesn't busy itself so much, perhaps. I'll have people fight me on this probably, but it doesn't busy itself so much perhaps with the specifics rather than this notion of bringing, people together. Having said that, there are definitely notions of like us versus them in the Shahnameh, and like when the Muslim armies come, I mean, there is this sort of despair and the losing of an empire. But at the end of the day, the fact that it becomes a text that even Muslim empires throughout history keep replicating and reusing, I think speaks more to it, let's say, than what the text itself even tries to say.
Yeah, that's really lots of food for thought, I think, there on the Shahnameh. Professor Acharya, I wonder then, when it comes to the Indic epics, similarly, to what extent, like we mentioned the influence in terms of literature and just the way it's from Southeast Asia through to Nepal, all of these places that the stories of the Mahabharata have kind of traveled. To what extent have these stories also transmitted and shaped what it means to be Hindu, like this notion of a Hindu identity?
Yeah, again, first of all, the idea of Hindu identity itself is a composite idea. So there are Shaivas, there are Vaishnavas, there are Shaktas, even from certain point of view, Bauddhas and Jainas, they are Indic from that point of view. Before we had a different kind of political awareness, let's say from Persian point of view, Hindu is everything. So everything related to the culture across the Indus is Hindu. So that is the origin. So we have these epics preserving all kinds of, as earlier I said, cultural memory, and not only cultural memories, our myths, stories. So that way they were binding together all, not only Indian subcontinent, but also even beyond that, like as I said, Southeast Asia, and anything Indic that way. Even in the background, Buddhist as well as Jainas, they also shared these stories, these cultural memories, and also these epics are mediums of education, like what is the Indian etiquette, which way we have to treat our nature, our environment, our seniors. So all these things, this is not only for one particular way, one particular region, one particular time, one particular period, or one particular religion in modern way, as we understand. So that's where the entire culture, the cultural it is a mine of cultural education and cultural teaching. So from that point of view, it's uniting even all the people of Indic culture.
Mhm. So would you say then, like I think Dr. Shayani just mentioned the power of the Shahnameh to, even though there is an us and them in the story, that it kind of binds people together. The same exists for the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. For example, in Indonesia, it's the world's largest Islamic country today, yet the Ramayana has a certain reverence there. So it kind of still binds people in a certain culture.
Yeah, definitely. Not only that, no, like you go to Kashmir or to Indonesia, they are Muslims, but they are bearing in your way Hindu names. No, like because the cultural background is still there, the underlying culture. So you can have no, like what was that? Mayavati Sukarno Putri. Yeah, we can read that as Sanskrit, and then certain things are related there. No? So maybe even though they are gradually losing, but in embedded level, the undercurrent is there, and they can that way identify. By the way, like Bhasha, no, like in Indonesia, their language is called Bhasha. My son goes to school, and then he finds some Indonesian friend, and then he says that Bhasha is my language, and he was surprised. Like Bhasha is simply language for us. No? So all language that way. But you see in which level and in vocabulary, in different levels of cultural understanding, it is still there.
And maybe if you can just expand on some of you mentioned in your opening statement, things like Purushartha, so these 4 aims. So what is the content of this culture, so almost that the Mahabharata and the Ramayana transmitting?
Yeah, but the Indian text, most of these texts, even if it is, for example, a text on mathematics, their ultimate aim would be to relate it to the higher values. No? So that is always there. But in case of the epic, these are the aims of human life. These are, you need to have virtue, you need to have initially education, and then education in virtuous behavior. Then not just that is enough. So you need also to have worldly prosperity, wealth you need. So they are not one-sided. Now, so they say that you should be dictated, guided by virtues, but you need wealth, you need pleasure. Now, so it is not taboo. Like you need to enjoy your life, but you should be guided by virtues, and you should be aware that eventually we have to liberate ourselves. So these relations, these entanglements, even in modern way, even here and now, we have to free ourselves from these entanglements. So these aims so are there underlying or explicit or implicit. So this is the ultimate goal of these texts and teachings. And also in different ways, but it's not only that. So suppose in human life we have different crises, and even like how human mind works. So how human mind can be mischievous. So these things are presented there, even in the form of the character of Krishna, who is the light, who is the guide, who is the companion, who is friend. But sometimes you see how mischievous he can be, and so on. So like in a number of characters there, Shakuni, maybe even without reading Mahabharata, many people remember that he is the symbolism of crookedness. And then also somehow he is together with other people, he is in the middle of the gambling and so on. So in a different ways, these like admonitions, as well as teachings, requests, all kinds of modes you find in these texts.
Wonderful. I think we now is quite a nice place to move to our Q&A. We've got lots and lots of questions in our Q&A. So we'll start with the first one from Pravarji. This is actually quite an interesting question. So maybe if we go to Dr. Shayani first for this question. So he asks, given the impact of epic in preserving cultural identity and transmitting morals, should reading epic play a greater role in our education system than it does today?
That's a great question. I think I'm biased, but yes, definitely. I think it should. Absolutely. I think, at least in the context of the Shahnameh, and I think as we've been talking about it, it seems in, even in the Indian context too, it sort of helps preserve our heritage and our identity. And so I think it's a shame not to. Yes.
Would you say that certainly in the West, I feel like, or in Britain, it doesn't really exist as such, but would you say in Iranian culture, even today, the Shahnameh is still somewhat alive amongst the people?
Yes, definitely it is. I think, we used to have this culture in the in Iran and also Afghanistan, I'm pretty sure, and I would imagine also in Tajikistan, where people could just recite, lines. I'm sure Iran and Afghanistan, where they could just recite lines of the Shahnameh off the top of their head. I think that's diminished, unfortunately, to a great extent. Having said that, people are still familiar with, Rostam, for example, to an extent, but less than I would hope that people would be. Yeah, I think it's something that we, I think at least in the context of the Shahnameh and in Iran, it's often seen as this nationalistic, trope. But I think instead of focusing on that, it would be better to put that energy in actually learning about the stories and the tales and preserving it in that sense.
And Professor Acharya, I wonder if maybe you could share some thoughts on this question.
Yeah, no, but there, let me add one thing, that in Indian context, probably the awareness is there, but going to the original, that is another issue. So maybe nowadays, maybe certain kind of people or class of people, they are more learning a little bit of Sanskrit and going back to the Sanskrit text, so that is good. And also the probably in even in vernacular literature, many people are relying and exploiting these epics and then writing even fiction and other things. So that way they are aware. But I would say that there are certain stories and certain characters, they are very well known, very famous, but there are in the Mahabharata as well as in Ramayana, there are some other really important figures, their discourses, their stories are there, which can be much more useful, relevant, equally in modern times. And we should be not simply relying on reading like Rama's stories and Krishna's stories, but we should read other even stories which are there in the epics. For example, like the stories of Janaka, or like the story of Sulabha. So there is discourse between Sulabha, who is a lady. So she is a female ascetic. So she is unique, and then she actually outsmarts Janaka, so which is rare. So in a different layer, we have the material there. We can read it from different aspect and reflect, and maybe we can have better reflection and consequence.
Wonderful. Sometimes I wonder whether it would be nice just to we just sit and read Shahnameh, or we just sit and read Mahabharata and all these stories. That would be another interesting evening to have. This next question comes from Arunji. This is for you, Dr. Shayani. So you mentioned about the agency of women in the Shahnameh. So could the popularization and adoption of this literature benefit Greater Iran today?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
And how so?
I think when we learn our myths and our legends, which in a way are our history also, even if they are, if they're based in myths and legends, we recognize the power that we have inherent within us. And it's inspirational. I think, today of Afghanistan and everything that's going on there. And I think of the princess of Kabul in the Shahnameh Rudabe, who's the mother of Rostam, the greatest hero of the entire text. And the only reason Rostam is born is because she takes matters into her own hand and follows and invites the man she loves to her chamber, and they discuss that because they love one another, they're going to fight for this love, and against all odds, they win. So, when you see the role that, for example, Rudabe has, and she's aided in all of this by her mother, Sindocht. So you see this role that women play, and that is actually what leads to the savior of the entire empire, ultimately. It shows you the important roles that women have played in our myths, and that, I think, makes room for people to realize that, women and men, but men, women should be able to have those roles today too. So yeah, definitely.
Great. And then maybe the next question for Professor Acharya. This is quite an interesting question. To what extent can we comment on the distortions of these original stories? This is from Sachinji. To what extent can we comment on the distortions of these original stories? Are these positives or something to be worried about?
Yeah, when it comes to interpretation, let's say distortion or interpretation, so somehow we have our perspective coming in there. So there, I would say that's why you need Oriental studies, you need religious studies, or you need philology. So you should be that way careful, and when you are interpreting, you do not in retrospective or from your you do not read your emotions and psychology there. For example, let's say the character of Ekalabya. So you can look at the devotion of the disciple, that, like Dronacharya asked him because he wanted Arjuna to win. So the Ekalabya, he comes from not from the royal family, but he is smarter than Arjuna, so he would not be the best archer. So that's why to make Arjuna the best, he asked Ekalabya to give him, the teacher, Dronacharya asked him to give his thumb. So that way he would never be able to shoot properly. So you can see that there is devotion of, and then without any questioning, he gives. So Ekalabya. On the other hand, you see what kind of teacher he is. So he is there is like a question there, and on the other hand, maybe also you may think it right or wrong, but let's say if Arjuna has certain role to play in the society in certain way, and then maybe what Drona did from certain perspective, let's say Drona thought that Ekalabya will join Kauravas, and then Kauravas is on the side of untruth, and so on. So you can look at it differently, but I would say that in modern context, we should look at the story or look at the statement from different angles, and then we should be more rational in interpretation, let's say.
Okay, and so
and
how would...
we need some acumen there, so that is important.
So would you say that, because we mentioned that these stories have layers of meaning, but
yeah,
in order to distinguish kind of a layer of meaning from a distortion, it's really up to us kind of to rationally kind of discuss and find out more plausible meanings and more kind of implausible.
Here, let me be even explicit to that. Even among Indologists, that is my profession, I heard that some even renowned Indologists thought or thinks that you should have certain framework, like you should have like Marxist framework or the nationalist framework. So without framework, I'm talking about real person, he or she, maybe there are many people that way, think that without any framework and without that guideline of that framework, we cannot read text. So I am really surprised there. My approach would be, let the text speak. So when we interpret the text, maybe it is a difficult task, but we should not start with such framework. So that is the starting point of distortion. So let's read the text and let the text speak, and then maybe further how it is received and how it can be received, and what can be the lesson in modern context, and how was the situation in the ancient context. That would be next level, but don't start with any preoccupied mind. So I would say that is the starting point of distortion.
I think that's certainly a sentiment that I share. Dr. Shayani, any thoughts on this question about distortions in the modern period? So to what extent can we comment on them? Are these positives or something to be worried about?
I think it's definitely, well, first off, let me say that exactly as Professor Acharya said, I agree with the same thing. Like, we should read the texts first and then, with an open mind, without projecting our own agendas onto it. I think it's definitely a thing that, yes, we have this issue with the Shahnameh too. There's a lot of distortions, and there are actually elements in the Shahnameh that people wonder if they were added later. For example, there's the end of the Shahnameh. There's a letter which one of the generals writes to, as the Persians are losing, the general writes this letter to his kinfolk back home, I think it is, and he says something to the extent of like, if the Arab armies win, then who knows what will become of the future of Iran, and there will be a race of men who are created in mixture of these two, and lies will become truth, and as if the whole world is going to turn upside down. And maybe it is part of the original Shahnameh. Like I was saying, it's not like it doesn't have this idea of us versus them, but increasingly, I think scholars today think that these are things that are then added later on, perhaps, not necessarily in the modern era even, but just, later on to sort of make it more black and white or create this dichotomy. And this is, of course, then later on used by, at least in the Iranian context with the Shahnameh, it's used by the Pahlavis, for example, the dynasty right before the revolution, to create this sort of more Iranian identity as a separate, further from the rest, and to help embellish their cause in a way. So yes, it definitely happens. It's definitely a problem, and it's definitely then abused.
Wonderful. I think maybe maybe two more questions. We'll see how we go. So the next question will continue with you, Dr. Shayani. So this is from Sumitji. So how do we make these stories relevant to the modern generation? And by doing so, do we lose any of the details or nuance, and do they become dumbed down?
That's a great question. I don't think they do. So I experimented with this a bit myself. Last year, I started these threads on Twitter where I would write the stories, in sort of in a modern tone, and tell the story in a slightly also comical manner. And they were quite well received. And in my own experience, whenever I tell these stories to my own peers, my own hyphenated Iranian peers, Iranian Americans, Iranian Canadians, so on, they love it. They find them really interesting. And I think this is, again, going back to what Professor Acharya was saying, is that because these characters are also human, that even 1,000 years later, you can still read them and relate to them and understand them. So I don't think, in my experience, that anything is lost necessarily. Sure, you might have to give context in here or there for something, but I think the essence remains, and it's understood and appreciated.
Okay. Wonderful. Professor Acharya, any thoughts? I think the Indic world has a multitude of cartoons, TV programs, comic books on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So any thoughts on maybe how do we make these stories relevant to the modern generation, and then do we lose any of the details, nuance, and do they become too dumbed down doing so?
Yeah, sometimes. And these days, somehow, so it is not only about the new generation, but in case of these myths and stories, particularly when there is divine aura and other things, many times the actual message can be lost. Like there are Krishna's stories or Rama's stories. People are driven by the glittering, the obvious. They do not go deep. but the message is always, as earlier we discussed, that behind the, so like Rama is, he is the ideal person, no? So he is the virtuous, he is the just, and so on. So we have to go beyond the myth, beyond the story, and the same way, like in case of Krishna, we have to go. We should not be deceived, cheated by these face values, and then the obvious. We should read a bit between the lines, a bit deeper, and then slow reading is needed, I would say, and slow watching is needed. Otherwise, things will be lost. We will be harvesting only the superficial.
So in some sense, it's important, while keeping them relevant, but to transmit that deeper meaning as well with whatever new forms that they may take.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So maybe if we kind of move on now to a final portion of our conversation, although I'm quite content to carry this on for much longer, but I think we'll hit our closing remarks now. So as a way of closing remarks, if we start, Dr. Shayani, with you, if you can maybe, as a summary, just share some thoughts on whether you think the preservation and the wider transmission of these stories has been beneficial for Iranian culture, or in other words, if the Shahnameh or the epic tradition had been kind of consigned to university departments, whether we'd see a much more kind of deprived Iranian culture today. And also, once you've done that, if you can share maybe a verse from the Shahnameh that you regard as particularly beautiful or particularly wise, that'd be great.
Yes, I mean, I definitely, like we were saying before, I think if it had been just allotted to the universities and withheld from the masses, it would be a shame. Thankfully, it hasn't been, and it's like we were saying, it's a text that is for the people, and it continues to preserve our the culture of greater Iran and the Persianate world. To my favorite, so the line that I would like to share with you actually is very appropriate to what's going on today too in Afghanistan. So this is by, like I was telling you, this is from the story of the Princess of Kabul, Rudabe, and this is her mother, Sindokht, who's a great queen, giving her hope in the midst of her despair and dismay that perhaps she won't be able to be with the one she loves, with Zal. And it's two couplets rather, sorry, 4 lines. So I'll read the Persian and then the translation. Agar chand bashad shab dir yaz, bar o tiragi ham namanad deraz. Shavad roz, chon chashme roshan shavad, jahan chon negin badakhshan shavad. So though the night may be long, the darkness will not set upon it, will not stay upon it for very long. Day will come again, and it will be like a brilliant spring, and the world will become like the glimmering gems of Badakhshan.
Beautiful.
Badakhshan is in Afghanistan, and it's a city that's known for its gems.
Beautiful. It kind of really does get across the kind of the genius of Ferdowsi as well.
Yes.
And the genius of that whole Iranian literary tradition. Wonderful. So Professor Acharya, the same question to you. So I'll just repeat the question. In your opinion, has the preservation and the wider transmission of these great stories been beneficial for their respective culture, and how so? Or in other words, if they weren't transmitted and just in classics departments in the university today, would we see a much more deprived Hindu culture today? And then after that, if you can share again a particular verse that you find beautiful or particularly wise as well.
Yeah, but it's not only in the universities in the West, but also in India itself. We need to have systematic study of these texts. As earlier we discussed and said, these texts are the mines of cultural memory, and then somehow even social etiquette, moral teaching, doctrinal philosophies, and so on. And these are in very plain, understandable words comparatively. So when we compare to other ancient texts, so these can be, if we try to some extent, this can be communicated very easily, and these are very important, and their reach is beyond India, beyond geopolitical barrier, and also, as earlier you said, beyond the religions. These stories, certain these elements, they are present, they have reached also like China, Tibet, in Buddhist Jataka stories, through Buddhist Jataka stories, and so on. So these can be communicated in a better way. So we should have systematic study of these texts. In case of maybe immediately, I don't remember in longer meter, but in some shorter meter itself, it is not that beautiful. I mean, I would say in words, but in terms of meaning, it is witty. Sandigdhe pipare loke tyajyameva shubham budhai yadi nasti tata kim syad asti chen nastiko hataha. So let me quickly translate. Even if the other, or the spiritual, the other world is considered doubtful, wise men should avoid doing bad things, inauspicious things. What wrong would be there if it doesn't exist? But if it exists, then the one who did not believe in good, did not believe in the other world, then he is ruined. So even if you are doubtful about it, it's better to do the good. So the auspicious.
Beautiful.
So yeah, this is just one example of witty saying from Mahabharata.
Wonderful. That one verse gets across to a large extent the appeal of the Mahabharata and the appeal of these stories. And certainly it's a wonderful way to kind of end our conversation here today, although I could continue for another hour and a half just listening to the Mahabharata and the Shahnameh being recited. And I'm sure our audience will join me in thanking both of our wonderful speakers here today, Professor Diwakar Acharya and Dr. Sahba Shayani, for shedding light on this very interesting and wonderful topic, and by kind of elaborating the beauty and the wisdom contained within these extraordinary texts. So on the one hand, we had the Iranian tradition encapsulated by the 11th century masterpiece called the Shahnameh, written by Ferdowsi, which is transmitted and shaped Iranian culture and identity for now a millennia. And then Professor Acharya, as we saw, elaborated not only on the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but the wider epic tradition and the kind of influence it had on literature, on culture, beyond the boundaries of India, into Southeast Asia and beyond. And although we came across numerous differences across this fireside conversation between these two traditions, they seem to share one thing in common, in that they are both very much alive in their respective cultures today. They're both treasured, and their authors and their characters are treasured in today's society. This treasuring has enabled the transmission of ancient wisdom and treasured values that form the identity of a cultural identity beyond notions of nationalism and politics even. Such a foundation is important for the development of a sustainable and cohesive society. But unlike Iran and the Indic world and kind of the wider, greater Iran that we talk about, and Bharata that we talked about, I would argue that wider society in modern Britain seems to have left its literary heritage in the scrapbooks of history into the ivory towers of the universities. So maybe a possible question for us to ponder over after this fireside is whether modern Britain has missed a trick by leaving its literary heritage, if not dead, but on life support at the very least. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, or even if for some strange reason you haven't enjoyed today's discussion, but you still see the value in our work, then please do consider becoming a well-wisher. Vichar Manthan is run on an entirely voluntary basis, and our work is supported by our generous well-wishers. So if you do wish to become a well-wisher, then you can do so by scanning the QR code on the screen or following the link that has been posted in the YouTube chat. We also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel by pressing the subscribe button below, and to join our mailing list by going to vicharmanthan.org/mailing list. That way you can stay up to date with our future Manthans, firesides, podcasts, and the book clubs that are currently going on all around the country. And finally, we hope to see you at our next event on Saturday, the 4th of September at 7 p.m. entitled How to Deal with Uncertainty. So once again, thank you all for joining us for today's fireside. And as a final thank you to our speakers, Professor Diwakar Acharya and Dr. Sahba Shayani. Namaste and Shubharatri.